Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Amy Schiller. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Dartmouth College, the Society of Fellows. She also is the author of the new book, The Price of Humanity: How Philanthropy Went Wrong and How to Fix It, which Corey Robin correctly calls a magical book. Amy Schiller, welcome to Current Affairs.
It's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, you are critiquing philanthropy. You are telling us how we can think about it differently, how we can do philanthropy differently. Let's start with the critique. Your second chapter says giving has become shopping. I would love it if we could take apart what it means for giving to become shopping.
Perfect. No better time to have this conversation than days before Giving Tuesday and the giving season, when all of a sudden the masses begin to really pay attention in earnest to their charitable giving. And you'll see so many fundraising appeals coming out in even a stronger force than they do year round. So giving as shopping is the kind of mass permeation and understanding of philanthropy as a purchase or an investment that you're making. So in other words, treating giving as if it's an extension of your other market transactions. So examples of this include cause-branded merchandise, brands like Tom's, brands like Red, the word red in parentheses. And the idea is like, oh, if you buy these products, then you're actually giving in sort of the bundle of money that you're handing over. Like your giving is built in because the brand is actually giving back and redistributing it. So it really makes it convenient for you, the giver/shopper. So that's just one very obvious example. And the extension of that is an attitude towards giving that says, I want to see the receipts behind like my dollars. I want to know exactly what impact my personal dollars generated. I want to know what social change I am personally responsible for. And there's a number of examples I elaborate on in the book, but essentially like this is the sort of mass absorption of a view of philanthropy that started with the billionaire class, but has really infused many of our sensibilities to make giving much more, not as opposed to a counterpart to our commercial transactions, an extension of them.
But as you point out in the book, there are kind of deep historical roots to this idea of giving as investing or buying something. And you point out that the Christian idea often has been, give to the poor because you're investing in your salvation. There's a certain kind of parallel in the way that you're going, well,
absolutely.
Give the money and you can be a good person. And don't think it's not even to help them, it's to help you.
You hit the nail on the head there. And I should say, I don't mean that our contemporary billionaire class thought this up all by themselves. I mean that the vocabulary that we use today to kind of perpetuate that attitude became popular first in the contemporary scene in high-level giving. And I do trace that in the book with sort of the emergence of Bill Gates and of philanthrocapitalism and that whole sort of set of ideologies that culminates in effective altruism that is the sort of contemporary version of utilitarianism. But yes, you rightly point out that this attitude does have its roots much further back. And I use St. Augustine as my exemplar of them. And he literally has words in his sermons as he's trying to convince Christians to target their giving where it will have the most impact, if any of that sounds familiar to you, to say, you give like a merchant who sends his wares to faraway lands and hope that they will return to a profit to him eventually. And that giving to the poor means that they will transport your good deeds to heaven. And as I said in another interview, presumably they do this via the service entrance. It's this real instrumentalization of poor people and their needs for the gratification and benefit and salvic salvic benefit of the donor themselves.
Yes, and you say, that the pitch that it conflated giving and investing a surrender of money that would not vanish into the ether, but would return eventually in the form of rewards for the giver. And you cite Pope Leo I preaching in, cost benefit terms. And one of the things that you point out is that this kind of giving, not only is it quite self-interested in that if you're just giving to save your soul, are you clearly not doing it just because you care about other people? I mean, early in the book, you talk about, seeing people as human beings versus seeing them as this thing called the poor that you must give to, or the blind, or the sick. And it sort of by definition, in a very obvious way, reduces them, eliminates their humanity, and boils them down to their deprivation as the sort of sole fact of interest about their existence.
Yes, absolutely right. So the starting point of the book is that philanthropy means love of humanity. And so the challenge is to say, how do we define humanity? Is humanity defined, and I know I can say this on this podcast, in a very biopolitical sense, as in mere survival for the sake of being economically productive, strong in numbers, sort of strong as a, planetary labor force, or more recently, perhaps an extraplanetary labor force? Or is it a definition of humanity that's much more capacious, much more appreciative of the qualities that actually make us human? That is our imagination, our creativity, our ability to collaborate and build an enduring world, and to have multiple perspectives negotiating shared space in a shared world. So the challenge for me was, okay, yes, there are some forms of philanthropy that distort that understanding of humanity to be this very reductive form that you describe, where people are sort of reduced to their symbolic use. They're just avatars, I say, of desperation. Or there are ways of doing philanthropy that actually affirm this broad vision of what makes us worthy and what makes us really worthy of love as human beings.
You open with this wonderful kind of Mad Lib of the classic charitable pitch, which I just read a little bit of here. Insert name is insert number years old, insert heartwarming detail with insert endearing physical feature. They suffer from insert ailment. Every day, they struggle to insert activity and has to travel insert distance just to get insert item. Yet with just insert small dollar amount, insert name could get the item they need. For just insert cents per insert unit of time, you could save insert name's life.
Yes, I'm glad that resonated with you. I had a lot of fun writing it.
Yeah. Well, you've worked in fundraising, so you've been exposed to a lot of these kinds of appeals.
Absolutely. It's my experience in fundraising as a consultant who's embedded in a number of nonprofits and having to traffic in these rhetorical strategies. I mean, it's not like anyone is sort of oblivious to their manipulations. It's just like, well, this is what works. And then we have to ask ourselves, why does it work?
Mm-hmm. Now, there are a number of kind of obvious critiques of philanthropy that can be made. And you do go through in the book things like when the rich are deciding what the good causes are, then their priorities become social priorities. One of the things, though, that I think is totally fascinating and novel about the argument that you make in this book is the effective altruists, who we've discussed on this program before, we might get a little bit more into. They have this pitch that says, well, you shouldn't give to universities and art museums because they are frivolous things, or compared to, morally, the suffering of children with malaria. It's immoral to donate to something as trivial as an art museum when there are all sorts of sick and poor and dying people in the world, and shouldn't we prioritize now? Now, obviously, the effective altruists also go in very weird directions where they say the most moral thing you could work on is artificial intelligence. Leaving that aside, there is something inherently compelling, I think, about that argument on the surface, which is, well, shouldn't you care about the worst suffering? Shouldn't that be your priority? But you almost flip it on its head and come to the ultimate conclusion that philanthropy, we should get to a point where it's about the trivial things. So, or the seemingly trivial or pointless or, the things that give us joy. So I want you to take us down the path of your argument so that we could get there.
Okay, thank you. So my concern is really the absolutism of the effective altruist view. And you gesture towards that. And the effective altruists are just one extreme expression of what I think is, for many people, very compelling, which is to say, I do want to address the worst suffering, the most marginal cases of need, or highest need, rather. My concern is twofold. One, to say that is the only or the most ethical way of approaching giving is to sort of reduce all of our engagement with the rest of the world to just survival, just helping the maximum number of people survive, as if there are no other registers of human experience that are important, that are worthy, and that need to be sustained alongside our very correct and valid struggles for justice and for making sure that we have a world that can sustain the lives as many of its inhabitants as possible. So one problem I have is with just the kind of flattening effect that argument has. The second is that it depoliticizes what are ultimately political questions. So for me, the important thing is that, yes, of course, people do need the basics to survive. They do need healthcare and medication and housing and food. Of course, they need all of those things, but we need to make sure that those are provided as rights and provisions of democratic institutions. So the sort of undergirding of my argument, which is to say, philanthropy should be focusing on the things that make us human, that give us joy, these non-urgent needs, but rather these sort of evergreen capacities and passions that we have. What has to undergird that is a commitment to a much fuller infrastructure of government support for our basic needs, because those should be provided as matters of right, not as matters of discretion or of having sort of struck the right emotional chord or the right persuasion of self-interest of others. They really should not be subject to that level of instability.
I suppose one way to think about this is to ask yourself the question, what should GoFundMe be for? And right now, it's often for, paying for, serious medical expenses or, the cost of a funeral or things that, people really shouldn't have to be begging strangers for. And you can say, well, isn't it more moral to donate to help people pay their medical expenses than to donate to, a community garden or some arts project? But GoFundMe is a terrible way to run a healthcare system, a healthcare financing system. You want that part solved. But importantly, in your argument, that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a GoFundMe. That doesn't mean that that sort of thing, that crowdfunding, this should disappear. It should just have a different function.
It struck me for a long time that philanthropy is the only kind of money, or maybe the kind of money with maybe just the most leeway to take a very long view and also a very wide view of who it is supposed to benefit. So which is to say, money that's used for for-profit initiatives has to start generating profit by a certain time and like on a frequent and recurring basis. Money that's used for social financing for governments. Now, some of this would be solved, of course, if we weren't so in the thrall of austerity politics. But even then, governments are often under pressure to be as cost efficient as possible. It's not quite legible to say, let's build something, truly like beautiful or grand with this public money that is often difficult to sort of build enough consensus around to be done democratically or sort of in those institutions. Instead, it's philanthropy that can do what the Cleveland Museum of Art's motto suggests, which is build things that exist for the benefit of all the people forever. In my opinion, philanthropic money, and not as even necessarily at the grand scale, but even at the small scale, philanthropic money is really money that we can use to think far, that long of a horizon and that wide of a scope.
Well, what's so interesting, as I kind of hinted here about your argument, is that I think as leftists, our instinct is to say, philanthropy is, is kind of the same as the effective altruist is, this spending money. How can, in a time of crisis, in a time of severe deprivation, spending money endowing various buildings on public arts projects. But you say, in fact, things should be, directed towards things that are more urgent. But perhaps not. Perhaps it is the case that philanthropy is this sphere where we can fund the things that are difficult to justify on utilitarian grounds. Correct.
And I know that you, Nathan, are sympathetic to that. I was just looking at your article of, I can't remember the title, in the frivolous or
in praise of the pointless. This is about a piazza in New Orleans that I think was private money was raised to fund this really stupid piazza, and it serves no function, but it's beautiful. And it got me thinking of some of the issues in this book, which is like, okay, but how do you have spaces like that, right? Someone's got to be willing to spend money on something that doesn't yield a return.
Right. That's exactly right. Well, I want to go over a couple of touch points about that. So I'm glad you said the word spheres, because you're reminding me that the political theorist Michael Walzer's separate spheres theory was really important to me understand, like sort of formulating this argument, which is to say, in Walzer, he's talking about like spheres of justice where there are kind of different frameworks for what constitutes justice. There's not one sort of monolithic definition. And so I sort of borrowed that framing as to say, like, we can have a just world where we understand that there's some money that is used for the necessities of survival and the basic needs of a dignified life. And then there is some money that does not have to follow that rubric, that can follow a much more expansive mandate of what kinds of things it creates and builds. And the other thing that's important about that is that sometimes those things, as I think you're getting at in your in praise of the pointless piece, is that those things actually run up against the sort of totalizing ambitions of neoliberal capitalism in a really important way. Creating those spaces that are pointless, creating those things that don't serve utilitarian purposes, they actually are sanctuaries that remind us that not everything we do has to be in service towards the kind of struggle for basic rights and basic justice that we can and should. And indeed, I think what makes us, again, human is that we can do things that are much more capacious and imaginative than that. And the final thing I'll say about that is that's why the Notre Dame Cathedral was such a central.
Yes, I was just about to pick this up, actually.
Yes. Great. So tell me how you responded to that.
It's chapter. So funny because, as I say, here's another example where I think you flip on its head the instinctual left reaction, which is that, so when Notre Dame caught fire, there was instantly money poured in from all over the world. People loved Notre Dame and, they wanted to restore Notre Dame. So they got tons and tons of money to fix Notre Dame. And of course, lots of people immediately comment, it's time of it's terrible suffering, people begging for, to have with their medical bills and their, just to pay for their insulin and whatever. But Notre Dame, the stupid cathedral, gets all this money. As I understand it, you're making, and you can clarify whether this is the correct statement of your point, is, well, ultimately, don't we want to fix the part where people are deprived of their basic needs so that the area of philanthropy is like for when a cathedral burns down?
That's right. And you've described it perfectly. And I think the sequencing of these things, and this is where Walzer is really handy, this idea of separate spheres is so important, because I think what the controversy, the backlash, and the money raised for Notre Dame was this spillover from political conflict, because it's a very important piece of context that Macron in 2017, just 2 years before the fire at Notre Dame, had come into office and implemented massive tax cuts that largely benefited the wealthy of France, instituted austerity politics and slashing of social welfare spending. There have been protests for months, the Yellow Vest protests that people might recall from the working class of France against these economic reforms. So there was this massive political contestation that, because there was no resolution to it, it sort of spilled over to say, well, if our politicians aren't going to be sympathetic to these demands, then it is our billionaires' responsibility to take them more seriously. Like that sort of that moral and sort of normative demand of one's government then sort of carried over to wherever the money was, that now it's the private citizens of France who should be ashamed for having pledged all this money for Notre Dame, when clearly they could have pledged it to resolve the social crisis. And it was that transposition that concerned me for a number of reasons. One, again, the depoliticization, the privatization of what are very right and just political demands is to just say like, well, whatever works, whatever, regardless of the consequences to our sort of political system, we're just going to go get the money wherever it can be found. I can certainly understand the pragmatism of it, but I think there's some terrible unintended consequences to that. And the other, again, is this flattening effect, which is to say, like, until, we resolve these social crises, we can't possibly make space for the value of a cathedral whose like gravitational importance to not just the wealthy of France, to everyone in France and to many people worldwide was so palpable in the moment when it burned. So to negate this thing that drew people together in such a powerful way, that was such a source of profound attachment, of connection to something larger, to say that doesn't matter because our energy should be completely and totally focused on this political struggle and everything is subsumed into that. That's the way to go. I thought, no, that's not right. There's more to our collective life than this, and we can't lose that understanding.
Well, one of the central points that comes across in your book is ordinary people, everyone, deserves beautiful things, right? And
yes.
We deserve the palaces for the people. We deserve cathedrals. We deserve museums that everyone can go to for free. And you have this wonderful, the left has historically called for bread and roses. And you say that, probably the correct way to think about how we fund stuff is government for the bread, philanthropy for the roses. So,
yes.
The state is supposed to take care of making sure that nobody is horribly deprived. And then once we have that foundation, then civil society can pool its resources to build things that don't serve those basic utilitarian functions.
Correct. Absolutely right. And, I get this question, and you may be gearing to ask it as well, of like, how does this really translate to the here and now, right? What does this mean for me next Tuesday when I have to decide where I'm giving my money? And to me, the important thing is like, as with any sort of visionary collective struggle, you have to sort of give for the world that you have and for the world that you want to build. That kind of like, we can hold two thoughts at once. We can do two things at once. To me, that's the most important contribution I can make in this book, is to say, like, not everything is reducible to the urgency, the very right and valid urgency of the struggle for economic justice, that there are things that complement it, that preserve humanity's sort of greatest capacity so that they're kind of always there for us as reinforcements, as sanctuaries, and as sort of exemplars of the vision of what we can all be as a society.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program. I take another point about how we should act in the here and now to be that those of us who wish to be philanthropists in the sense of lovers of humanity shouldn't just pursue charitable works, but should be part of larger struggles for economic and social justice. And the critique of the effective altruist, which I've made this critique too in a long article called Defective Altruism. And one of the central points there was it's depoliticized. This whole idea is that all you have to think about is how rich people ought to spend their money. But it's like, okay, but you need to be part of campaigns to alter the conditions that are causing you to have to ask this question.
Yes. And I have some proposals in here that are like,
You do.
okay,
Yes. You have practical proposals.
I do have practical, believe it or not, folks, she's got practical proposals. And I think the central one, this is sort of the one that connects this vision of what giving could be and what circumstances we need to sort of make that possible, is the idea of a giving wage, that we sort of increase our demand from a living wage, which is already, I think, rather like barely adequate, to the idea of like, what if everyone was paid enough that they could afford to contribute, that they could afford to be a philanthropist at some scale?
Mm-hmm. I love that because, yes, one thing that you argue very strongly in this is that philanthropy shouldn't just be for the rich. Everyone should have extra. Everyone should have enough to give away. I love that contrast between the living and the giving wage, because living is its bare subsistence. Oh, we want wages that we can cause us to subsist. Now, that's a very reasonable demand at a time when it's impossible to pay your rent on your pay. However, we really ought to raise our expectations and have as a standard that people ought to be able to have enough spare cash to where, when there is some project like building the next Statue of Liberty. You cite the Statue of Liberty as an example of something that the community of non-wealthy people came together to help support. That those sorts of things can happen.
Yes. You asked earlier, what should GoFundMe be for? And we have our counterpart right there. We have our early crowdfunding victory right there in the story of the Statue of Liberty, right? Where the readers of Joseph Pulitzer's paper, The New York World, over a number of months, like they sent in contributions of 10 cents, 5 cents, and they were all listed in the paper to raise over $100,000 for the pedestal and the installation of the Statue of Liberty. And Pulitzer says this is not a gift. The statue is not a gift from the millionaires of France to the millionaires of America. It's from the whole people of France to the whole people of America. So we have in our own history this vision of, yes, like crowdfunding and of small dollar giving as a genuinely world building exercise.
Another thing you do in the book is you go through and, you look at some of history's most famous philanthropists then and now, in the past, Jane Addams and Andrew Carnegie, in the present, LeBron James, Mackenzie Scott. And, you find in each of them, problematic aspects of the way that they approached. I mean, Carnegie writes this book that essentially argues that it's fine to make your money however you like, no matter how exploitative and horrible you are, but your job afterwards is to serve humanity.
Right.
But you point out that there are lessons from the ways that he did choose to serve humanity, like building wonderful libraries, that we can take. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the lessons you get from profiling these particular cases.
Yeah, no, thank you. Something I didn't write about in the book, but I think is helpful for thinking about why Carnegie's work was as valuable as I think it was, is that Carnegie built this massive nationwide network of libraries, and he wanted them to be beautiful and grand structures. You use the phrase palaces for the people. That's Carnegie's phrase, that he had the leeway to do it that way. And those libraries are still anchors of communal life throughout the United States. And there are some actually globally as well, that they bundle together the provision of basic social needs. So unhoused people are able to be there for warmth and shelter, for restrooms, for other social services. Arguably, we overburden our libraries with some of those tasks today, but that's a story for another time. And there are these like incredibly grand spaces of exploration, discovery, human aspiration, community, and beauty, as you point out. So you have this example from Carnegie, and we're really just talking about like the results, right? How do we sort of judge the results of his giving? And I judge that very highly, especially when compared to his counterparts today, like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, who care not a whit for the earthbound community, for the local population of any scale, but really think only of building space colonies, in which, by the way, we would all be enslaved. So,
that does seem to be the implication. They don't state that outright, but every time you hear them describe it, you really get that vibe.
Yeah, I mean, it's the ultimate offshoring, right? That's obviously the game. So if you contrast like, wow, okay, so this is a philanthropy that, and by no means does this, legitimize or excuse the abuses of workers that are associated with the accumulation. It's just to say, like, let's just narrow our goalposts a little bit and say this vision of philanthropy, however oligarchic in its origin, created a common world. And this version of billionaire philanthropy is going to utterly dissolve the common world and utterly negate the sort of higher gifts and capacities of human beings. So can we borrow from Carnegie's example, especially to counter the ambitions of Bezos and Musk and their counterparts today? So that was one. I mean, the concluding example in the book is LeBron James. LeBron James and his counterpart, Jane Addams, founder of Hull House. What I loved about those two is that they created institutions, Hull House in Chicago, for Jane Addams, the I Promise school and housing community and other sort of network of nonprofits in Akron for LeBron. They really exemplify this ability to do both and to keep one's eye trained on this is not just to serve a functional purpose. We are serving functional purposes because that's what's needed at this moment. But our ultimate aim is to really help people cultivate themselves as full human beings. And Addams did that at Hull House by really emphasizing that poor and working class people want space for culture and recreation and community. And LeBron does it with this one gesture in particular, which is giving every kid at the I Promise school a bike and a helmet and saying, when I was a kid, having a bike was what made me feel free. Those are LeBron's words. And you think, boy, feeling free does not really lend itself to quantifiable documentation. It's not a concrete ROI kind of thing. Like if you want kids to feel free, that means you are really doing this because you want them to flourish as people without any oversight or control or kind of surveillance of how that happens, at least in that, when the bikes are concerned.
Yes, and we can contrast that at the beginning. We're talking about the flattening of humanity that comes with seeing people as the poor or the sick, and the poor in need of alms and in need of money. What if we thought more? What if we spoke to people about what kinds of things make them feel free?
Yes.
What do they want out of life? And it's not just like, well, please don't let me die. Which obviously we don't
Right.
want people to starve to death. So you want to have, you want to feed people, you want to have a full belly, but you want the roses. Everyone's entitled to the roses. And it's important
That's right.
that that's not just rhetoric, to take that seriously, right? When we say bread and roses, we say it a lot, and it lapses into cliche, but you really I think you shouldn't just build a school for kids who don't have a good school. It should be a beautiful school. It should be a school where whenever they go to it, it's breathtaking.
Right. Well, the phrase that I used for that is magnificent philanthropy.
Magnificent. Yes. You say this.
And that, it's that value of like really raising your sights, really raising your game. It's like, magnificence really encapsulates exactly like breathtaking and beautiful and all those things that give us a sense of dignity, a sense of vision, a sense of feeling valued in the world. That, yes, that's the thing that philanthropy can do. And we really quite desperately need it to provide that at this time.
Again, those on the left might, when they hear the term philanthropy, and I hope they read your book, because I think this tendency would be turned off by the word philanthropy, because you think that philanthropy would only exist in a world where there are billionaires. Right. If we tax the rich, if we tax all their money away, then, philanthropy disappears because we've redistributed wealth. We've solved the problem. Philanthropy only exists in a society where some people have too much wealth. But you make the argument that you could tax billionaires out of existence, but because of your whole idea that ordinary people should be able to endow things with resources, we can imagine a much, much, much more equal world that still has philanthropy, that love of humanity, that donating to common projects, donating time, donating resources, that doesn't have to go away. And in fact, it can achieve its true and more beautiful purpose.
Yes, everyone should read my book.
Yes, I agree.
Yes, but and I am so energized by conversations with my friends and my comrades on the left because I know that what I'm saying is so counterintuitive. I know that what I'm saying feels like such a potential defense of very like aristocratic norms, a defense of legitimizing this power structure that we're supposedly fighting against. And it definitely is a delicate, threading of things to say, like, we can retain this sensibility, we can redistribute it in a way that is widespread. And I think the most important thing is we actually really need to do that because there are so many pressures now that say all of life, all of our individual lives and all of our collective lives are kind of subsumed to the struggle for survival. This is like, the living wage is just one expression of this, right? That we are all focused on surviving, being economically productive, being economically sustainable. There's so much pressure to think in this way in ways that we don't even realize. And it's gotten to us to the extent, to go back to the beginning, that we think like everything is a purchase. Everything is, a for-profit transaction. That's how deeply these ideas have sedimented in us. And so more than that, I actually think it's vital that everyone embrace this idea that like, no, there is something grander in store for us and that we want to advocate for it, not as the kind of indulgence of the elite, but as a value of everyone.
Yeah, I will say to our listeners and to our readers in the transcript version that Amy has not written the book that you necessarily think she has written from hearing that it's about how to fix philanthropy, because you might assume that she has written a guide for wealthy people to how to spend their money differently. But it's such a delightful surprise throughout for me to think, it will really get you to think. One of the things I love is that you, if I wasn't enjoying myself enough, my favorite book in the world is A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander and others. And then at the end, you talk about all the wonderful things that are in A Pattern Language, this just eccentric kind of supposed architecture guide, but it's kind of a guide about how to live the good life. And you're like, these are the things that we need, the beautiful and the strange.
Wow. What incredible serendipity. And to think that was waiting for you at the epilogue.
I know.
Wow, that really was
pattern language.
The end, pattern language. So funny, I met someone on a train who was a city planner, and I knew that if I told him I referenced Bernard Rudofsky, that I would absolutely have his attention. And I was right. This is another thing about the book. I will say that I really enjoyed sprinkling in such an eclectic spread of references and texts and pop culture and literature and architecture theory, as you point out. It really, one of the greatest pleasures of writing this book, and I hope it's one of the great pleasures of reading it.
Let us also say that your writing style is fun, because this is not clear from the cover of a book. When you're talking about Seneca, you say, here's the thing about Seneca. This is the start of a chapter, founder of Stoic philosophy. He's a little intense. I think it's fair to call him uptight, rigid even. Having extremely high standards is kind of his whole deal. You're a very conversational writer in a way that makes it pleasant.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's something I really treasure about the book, and I'm so glad I was able to...
It's like sitting down and having a chat to read it. So. Okay, well, so the book is The Price of Humanity, How Philanthropy Went Wrong and How to Fix It, available from Melville House. Amy Schiller, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Such a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Nathan. I can't imagine a better interviewer.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.